Hi everyone, welcome to this latest episode of VFX Artifacts. I'm Ian Fales from beforesanafters.com. Now, one of the suggestions I received about covering a VFX artifact was stop motion. And specifically, someone said, come on, the ED-209 robot from RoboCop has got to be a VFX artifact. Well, it just turns out that a couple of years ago I interviewed Phil Tippett about ED-209 in RoboCop, and I thought what I would do is produce that interview here as a podcast episode where you can get insight on how Phil and his team animated ED-209, including some pretty specific sequences like the falling down the stairs or when he does get blown up and is just a pair of legs. Always a pleasure to chat to Phil. I've been really lucky to talk to him many times over the years, including on stage at places like FMX, and he was very generous going through RoboCop here. So please enjoy this special episode of VFX Artifacts with Phil Tippett on ED-209.
I wanted to ask you straight away about RoboCop. What, if you could set the scene, what you were doing at the time that you were asked to come on board, and how you did actually come on board the film.
Well, I was friends with the producer, John Davison, and we had met on Joe Dante's Piranha that John produced, and we got along really well together, and John was a big fan of stop-motion animation, and so he was always looking for a property to, do something with, and RoboCop came along, and he gave me a call, and I went down and met with Paul, and we got along, and so I got hired.
Was it always mostly ED-209 that was going to be stop motion there, or was there other talk of, RoboCop himself being brought to life that way more than he actually ended up being?
No, it was only ED-209 and some of the Kyoto Brothers commercial stuff.
Right. And what do you remember about ED-209 right from the beginning, and how the director and how the filmmakers wanted to bring that to life? Because it's obviously the huge prop, but then it's your incredible work as well.
Well, it started with, I think Ed Neumeyer found a Japanese model kit design whose arms ended up with like these big guns. So that was the idea from the beginning. And so I engaged Nilo Rodis, who was one of the art directors, visual effects art directors on the Star Wars movies with me. And Nilo started the design process, and he got pulled away on something else. And I happened at a barbecue to run into this kid who was amazing. He was barely 20. His name was Craig Hayes, and he worked for this guy that did prototypes for military helmets and things like that. But he was a really great designer and a really great craftsman who knew all kinds of production tricks. And so I hired Craig to come on, and he and I would go down to Los Angeles and talk with Paul and develop the design for ED-209.
And what do you remember was some of the main things that needed to go into that design? The tank-like look, and just what else you wanted to put into the design?
Well, Paul was very adamant that it be, a non-anthropomorphic thing, and that it be like a Z, he said. So Craig kind of designed these legs that kind of look like a Z, and then the thinking was, for its head, he'll have a big, kind of a radar sensor. That's what his head will be, this big black thing. And then he had a grill for a mouth. And for a while, something was wrong. We couldn't figure it out. And then I realized, hey, you know what? Turn the mouth upside down because he's smiling. And so we turned the mouth upside down and kind of gave him a more ominous look.
In terms of how you were going to approach the animation for ED-209, obviously you'd been doing or been known for some go motion stuff. But I'm guessing that wasn't applied here. Was there any reason, how did that come down in terms of go motion or sort of more traditional stop motion?
Well, we couldn't afford go motion, so that was that.
Right.
And in terms of believability, robots tend to lend themselves to the stop motion process.
Great. Well, can you outline a bit about the process of of animating ED-209, just in terms of the typical setup you had, especially maybe that staircase sequence, which is really cool.
Most of the staircase sequence was animated. I did a few of the beginning shots, and then Randy Dutra did the close-ups with the head and the feet, and that was. And then the final shot was a high-speed miniature, shot at like 96 frames a second of him tumbling down the steps. So, Paul had the scene all storyboarded out, and we went to Texas, to Houston, and we shot all of the background plates, so we knew exactly what the shots were that were going to contribute to the scene. And then I worked very closely throughout the thing with the editor, Frank Curiosity, to cut the material together.
Was there anything also that you remember about the actual style of walk, like the walk cycle and motion put into ED-209? Because he is awkward, but also
No,
menacing.
well, I had a idea in my head, and I had to do a number of just kind of rehearsal type things, because it was nothing organic could walk like that. So I had to figure out how to make a believable walk cycle out of the configuration that Craig had come up with, and it had like a non-anthropomorphic thing. Not only was Z-shaped, but it was driven by a kind of a big lead screw that pumped his legs up and down. So it was like a very non-human kind of thing. So it was just a matter of doing a number of takes and getting comfortable with what it was, and then we're ready to do it.
Do you remember the fact that it was sort of done with a bit of rear screen projection as well, and sort of split screen work? Can you give me a sense of the time it would take to do a typical shot?
Yeah, we were on. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of money for
Right.
that. We had to execute about 50 shots, and so we were working within a time frame. And Harry Walton and I did most of the setups, and Randy came in for a few of the shots, and again, Harry animated a couple of shots as well. And so we would set up everything and get all the pieces in place, the table and the rear screen, and put the puppet on a table and start balancing the rear screen for brightness and color and all of that stuff. We shoot wedge tests every day, and that would go to the lab. The next day we'd come back and make the correction. So depending upon the level of complexity, it would be like 2, maybe 3 days of setup time and then shoot. And we pretty much got everything first take. So that was like, from 3 to 4 days per setup.
In some ways, he ends up being a comical source in the film, especially when he kind of gets blown up and his legs walk around. I remember reading something about that. Can you tell me about how that came about?
Well, that was always the plan, to have him walk in with his, without his top part. But as I was and that was a tricky shot to set up. That took a little bit longer than most, because we had to do a blend of the miniature ground that the robot was walking on with the ground and the background plate. And so that took a while to set up. And just before we were ready to go, now I'm remembering too. But just before we were ready to go, John called me up and said, "Hey, the movie's gotten too serious. Do something funny with him." And so I found some little whirligig model parts of little spinning fans and things like that, and I just played him not as a monster, but as like a dysfunctional drunk. and I kind of took like this big risk. I shot the shot, and no, I didn't do that. I timed the shot out, and then against a piece of black velvet, I shot a smoke element that moved in concert with what I was going to do stop motion wise, and shot that on film first, and then backwound the camera and did like a in camera kind of a trick where I double exposed the smoke over the stop motion.
And I'm just curious if you remember back in '87 the reaction to ED-209 and just the general film itself. Whether that surprised you, whether you thought you knew what kind of reaction it would get, and also the enduring reaction to it, just from your perspective in visual effects.
Well, the first time we saw everything together was at the cast and crew screening in Hollywood at the Academy Theater. And we, knew that we'd, worked on a really terrific movie. And then, magazines started picking it up, and Newsweek wrote a big cover article on it. And, so it, because one of the big smash hit of that summer. And, you're always lucky when you get involved with something that turns out good, because you work on a lot of things that aren't.
I wanted to ask you too, I always loved that ED-209, when it was a big, prop on set, and then it transitioned or cut to a stop motion shot, it may well be that you could tell, and it was just part of the era of the time. But in fact, because it's all handmade and there in the frame and real, it sort of has this different feeling as a moviegoer. I wonder if you might have any thoughts on that, just from your history of stop motion, and just why you think it still works. Because clearly now people would say, oh, well, that's one or the other, or they'd want it to be CG. But I'm just curious about your thoughts on the aesthetics of going from prop.
Well, it was more. It wasn't really an aesthetic. It was more of a practical decision on my part, well, on Paul's part. But we had a problem, and the problem was money. And so when Ronnie Cox gives a big speech about the future of law enforcement with this robot, and so I pitched to Paul that we do all the ambulatory shots with a stop motion puppet, and then have Ed come in and power down for the speech. And then we switch to the live action prop, but we keep Ed alive with like a bass kind of a pedal note, like a hum, like a ominous electric hum that keeps his character present. And Paul totally bought into it, and so that's how that came about.
And there you have it. That was Phil Tippett talking to me a few years ago about ED-209 in RoboCop. Since then, some really exciting things have come out from Phil and Tippett Studios, including his incredible film Mad God, which is just getting released now at several film festivals. Make sure you check that out. I'll include a link in the show notes. And also check out the show notes for some cool behind the scenes for ED-209. Make sure you check out them at beforesandafters.com, and you can also follow me at Ian Fails on Twitter. Thanks for listening, guys. See you later.